Welcome to our study, our session of study and practice. I'm just going to need the somebody on the online, please, in the question box. Can you just type in whether you can hear me or not? Because my computer is being strangely quiet. So all good? We can. Fantastic. Can hear you? Yes. Very good. All right. Good. So welcome to, and we're still right at the beginning of this study here, which is called Progressive Stages of Meditation and Emptiness, which, well, I tend to sort of obviously try to find decent material to present in these classes, but I'm very happy with this book because it really combines the traditions of, you could say, inquiry with practice. And it's touching on the most essential aspect of Buddhist, the Buddhist path, which is the dimension of prajna, where we actually aim at seeing through our delusional constructions. So of course, one thing is that the Buddhist path is wonderful in terms of creating peace of mind through meditation, adopting and embracing an ethos of compassion and non-aggression and so forth. But there is actually a very radical component to the Buddhist teaching, which is this insight into the fact that phenomena, whether it's our subjective dimension of our consciousness or what we perceive as an external solid reality, nothing possesses an unchanging, unitary, unconditional, inherent existence. And that really is what constitutes the difference between the Buddha and sentient beings. That's really what constitutes the difference between us continually perpetuating a cycle which leads to suffering simply because of our assumptions around the solidity of phenomena, the solidity of our own self. And that is, of course, then where we talk about ego. And in popular, discourse, in our vernacular, ego is a terrible thing. But very often we talk about ego as if it's something that we need to restrain, that it's kind of a given that we have a certain selfishness, and then we can restrain this ego. And normally, of course, we do it in various ways on the basis of our own sort of moral compass, or also, the legislation is in place so that we don't sort of to abuse our fellow citizens on the basis of our selfishness. We have laws in place that prevent that and all of that. So there is a sense that ego needs to be restrained, but it's also something that's always there. There's sort of an assumption around what is then known as the selfish gene. And that the Buddha challenges. That assumption is basic to the entire Buddhist culture of enlightenment as it's existed from the Buddha down to the present day. And that's where generation after generation of men and women achieved freedom and liberation and broke free of this delusion that we call samsara, and displayed really remarkable qualities of awakening on the basis of seeing through this, what we in Buddhism then refer to as the delusion of fixating on a self. So that's where the present text is very helpful in that regard, taking us gradually through this inquiry and the discovery of the, you could say, the flaw in our assumption. So it's not as if we're just going to have to snap out of it on the basis of some mystical revelation, or all of a sudden we're just out of it, out of ego. But it's more that we actually look and we see whether or not there is any basis for this, what the Buddha then would say, this deluded assumption around the solidity of self and other. So presently then, we've covered the topics of how we actually approach the path in terms of cultivating prajna, where we first listen to the teaching, and then we reflect on it critically, and then finally where we then we integrate this vision through meditation. So that's also where once we have that in place, then the vision around meditation is no longer just about us using meditation as a means to enable and succeed in what we want. So sometimes, mindfulness is sort of hooked up with the agenda of simply just feeling good. And that's not really where we in any way challenge the real cause of suffering, which is this notion of self. So that's where in Buddhism, this insight into no self is coupled with meditation, but meditation is very much seen as a way in which we could unravel, in which we could relax into an experience that allows for us seeing the lack of necessity and the seeing how, in fact, this assumption around the ego is baseless, and also then integrating this experience. So that's where meditation takes us beyond just the intellectual insight, or you could say the philosophy aspect or the theory aspect, into actually integrating this in terms of experience. And that's where we're going places in some way that is that's for us, we could say, uncharted, but then again, we can, to a large extent, certainly rely on the fact that for 2,500 years, men and women have confirmed, yep, this works a marvel. So that's where we're coming at it with, you could say, we presumably giving the Buddhists, the sages in Buddhism, giving them the benefit of the doubt, and hopefully we're sort of hearing them out in terms of making their case for no self. And that's where then Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso's work here, this present study, is very, very helpful. So we're looking at really what is the opening spaces or the opening place, the gate of the path, which is where we begin to first look at our own situation and deal with the primary issue then when we engage in the path, which is this sense of I. So we'll eventually also look at what we call the self of phenomena, but first we're looking at the self of person. And where we got to last time is in this, you could say, investigation. Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso then says, we all act as if we had permanent, single, and independent selves, that it is our constant preoccupation to protect and foster. So that's a given, that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that, but we are going to hopefully expose this as a little bit of an unnecessary worry. He says it is an unthinking habit that most of us would normally be most unlikely to question or explain. However, all our suffering is associated with this preoccupation. All loss and gain, pleasure and pain arise because we identify so closely with this vague feeling of selfness that we have. We're so emotionally involved with and attached to this self that we take for granted. So again, this is where Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso also is remarkable in that he's actually engaged in some very interesting conversations with his students around where the Western belief system is centered in terms of the self, and what are the foundations for the general phenomenology of self as we have it in Western psychology, and we also have it in Western science, where we essentially would identify all our neural activity with the self, and just saying this is just a normal thing. So he's you could say bringing in that aspect as well. We don't have to ourselves actually cross that bridge. He's very, you could say, conveniently meeting us on that. But then going a little bit more into the application, he then says meditators do not speculate about this self. So that means that we're not going to, the journey is never going to be our sitting down, sort of like thinking deep, long thoughts and sitting and meditating. Do I really have a self and all of that? That's not really how it works. So as much as we initially, you could say, expose the weakness in our assumption and also see the counterproductive nature of this habit, then it's not as if we then perpetuate philosophical speculation, really. And he says they do not have theories about whether it does or does not exist. So initially, yes, that's where we look at it. That's where we establish the view, we have a perspective. But when we're meditating, then we're not sitting there wondering, is there really a self or not? So he says instead, they just train themselves to watch dispassionately how their mind clings to the idea of self and mind, and how all their sufferings arise from this attachment. So that's why it's quite clear where when we get uptight around me, then we have proportionate suffering. When we relax and have less uptightness around self, then also we have less suffering. And that's where we're just aware of that. And that's where you very quickly sort of discover what it tastes like. So that's all where you're just aware of it. And that's where you just begin to see the validity of the path. So at the same time, he says, they look carefully for that self. They try to isolate it from all their other experiences. Since it is the culprit as far as the suffering is concerned, they want to find it and identify it. The irony is that however much they try, they do not find anything that corresponds to this self. So let's just right away be clear, and we're not talking about some kind of like, how do you say, demonizing the notion of clinging to a self. Clinging to a self is completely normal. It's been going on for a very long time. There's no sort of sense that, gosh, if I have any inclination towards pleasing myself, I'm obviously, the devil has entered me and I'm evil and wicked and all of that. So in that sense, it's just seeing that there's a little bit of a little bit of a delusional condition that's lingering, but it's all very workable. There's a lot of understanding of innocence, and there's a certain amount of sense of humor around this. Ourself, our seriousness around self, it generally elicits a fair few smiles. So that's where it's something that we already are onto in some sense. So he says Westerners often confuse self in the context with person, ego, or personality. So we're not really saying that if there's a roll call and if somebody says Jakob, then I'm not supposed to stick my hand up, and say there is no self. That's not the point. But it's more that we sort of, you could say, it takes on an exaggerated importance sometimes. And that's where we more sort of identify you could say it sort of rears its head. It's possibly narcissistic head, or possibly rather big ego or sensitive or uptight head. But we're not particularly talking about the fact that we have an identity, a passport, or a name, that's in itself a problem. So that's where the Khenpo says Westerners often confuse self in this context with person, ego, or personality. They argue that they do not think of the person, ego, or personality as a permanent, single, or independent entity. This is to miss the point. The person, personality, or ego as such are not the problem. One can analyze them quite rationally into their constituent parts. The Western tradition has all sorts of ways of doing this. That's where, for example, we have famously Descartes, who says, I think, therefore I am. And that's not really a problem. Obviously, yes, he's definitely there. There's, him in the barrel, right? I think he sat down in the barrel and sort of did his meditations there. But anyway, that's not the point. But at the same time, also, the moment we say, I think, therefore I am, then also we're actually identifying that what qualifies that as that self. If it's the thoughts, well, there's a lot of thinking going on. And that's where we have moments after moments after moments of thoughts that it's there, that we could say, okay, if you think that's the self, then you have a lot of selves, because you would actually have as many selves as you have thoughts. So anyway, the Buddha's way to talk of this sense of self is what is then known as the 5 skandhas, the 18 dhatus, or the 12 gates of consciousness. And this we've actually looked at in the context of the Abhidharma studies that we looked at last year, or for the starting, for about a year and a half, we were going through this. And essentially just we identified the nature of self is something that's constructed. It's constructed in terms of its sense of person that justifiably has you could say, an aggregation of body and mind, but it's then that we attribute solidity or self to what in fact is ever-changing aggregation, an ever-changing web of causes and conditions. And that's where we then look at how self is constituted on the basis of body-mind aggregation that we call the 5 skandhas. We speak about how we interact with subject and object, all the various fields of consciousness. And so there's various ways of getting at this essentially constituted experience that we simply just label as self. But if we look, it's actually complex. It's many different things. And it's not as if we want to go into the complexity of it and have a long discussion about it, but we just want to smell the rat, in that once that there is, in fact, many different constituents to this so-called self, where do we actually, how can we justify this sense of self? And while we can, of course, during roll call, we can say, yes, Jakob is here, the whole drama, the whole emotional uptightness and where we get wound up around me is actually not justified. And to just for a moment digress, then also we can say, on the basis of our intuition, we can say we are much easier off when we don't get all wound up around self. And when we do, we have a lot of suffering. So the more that we can actually relinquish this sense of self, the easier it is. So that's something that we can intuit. But the Buddhists, they actually go about it very rationally in terms of just analyzing and seeing, is there any basis for this self when there is such a wide variety of complex causes and conditions? So the Khenpo continues, the question of whether or not the personality of ego is changing, the question is whether or not the personality of ego is a changing composite train of events conditioned by many complex factors. So that is what we're then looking at. Any rational analysis shows us that this is the case. Anybody who spends time with us will confirm that we're complex. We are many different things. The question is, he says, why then do we behave emotionally as if it were permanent, single, and independent? And that's where we need to actually have this humble recognition that, yes, actually we are many different things, and yet isn't it odd that we do actually react in this way? And that's where we need to engage in a rather intimate personal investigation that is actually essential, because that is where can we justify this whole drama around me, when in fact we fail if we were to look, can we find a permanent, unchanging, singular, independent self? The Buddha is not keen on us just picking up the answer and saying, okay, Buddha, you say that there's no self, fine with me. The Buddha actually wants us to go through the sort of the hard yards of undertaking this investigation, because it's only on the basis of that we begin to relinquish this belief system. And we'd have to be very alienated to ourselves if we don't acknowledge that that belief system is pretty firmly embedded in our personality and in the way that we act. So the Khenpo says, thus, when looking for the self, it is very important to remember it is an emotional response that one is examining. When one responds to events as if one had a self, for example, one feels very hurt or offended, one should ask oneself, who or what exactly is feeling hurt or offended? And that again is where we should welcome any situation in which our ego is somewhat feeling sore. And actually, that's the opportunity. It's not going to help if we're just sitting in a meditative equipoise and everything's blissful and wonderful, and then we say, oh yeah, there's no self, That's all too easy. It's actually when the chips go down and we are feeling that ego, that sense of me, somebody gave me the finger, or somebody called me a moron, or somebody asked if I was stupid, stuff like that. And that's where we actually need to say, oh, this is great, And so we should feel very grateful in these conditions, and basically just take that as an opportunity to really look at what's the foundation for this. Now, we even have it just in terms of us in our ordinary life, somebody, we're being offended, and then we're with a friend and we're kind of like offended. The friend just says, relax, who cares? And that's where we can see there's a juxtaposition between our intense sort of drama, and from the outside, it really looks like not a big deal. So that we can see there's no absolute quality around this. If you are not convinced that you behave emotionally as if you had a lasting, single, and independent self, then it's important to address yourself to this issue before moving on and to consider the doctrine of non-self. This is actually where we need to say, okay, this is our homework. We need to get this one down before we move on. The Khenpo says, think carefully about pain and suffering and ask yourself, who or what is it that is suffering? Before this begins to sound too ethereal and theoretical, I would like to say that my own experience, and also hearing about the experience of works like someone like Jon Kabat-Zinn, it is possible to extract oneself from the ordinary way that we relate with pain through actually this kind of analysis. I've seen it work on myself, I've worked with others, and I've also, Jon Kabat-Zinn actually in his work with what he calls the pain clinics, actually has very, very, you could say, concrete and very great success rate in terms of working individuals, not individuals who are particularly on the path to enlightenment, but simply just working on the basis of ordinary persons that want to be able to cope with pain. And that is where this kind of investigation query actually enables us to lift ourselves out of this condition. So this is also where Jon Kabat-Zinn, he founded this system called MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. But the thing is also that in this discovery here, it's not just about us being able to handle what is uncomfortable, but it's really also for us to begin to see through an assumption that is this emotional uptightness, and begin to see it for what it actually is, namely a hoax. And that is what the Buddhist teaching really is about, that there's a hoax that has taken place, there's a delusion that takes place. So that's where we question. The Khenpo says, who is afraid of what will happen? Who feels bad about what has happened? Why does death seem such a threat when the present disappears every moment, scarcely having a chance to arise? You will find that your thinking is full of contradictions, inconsistencies, and irresolvable paradoxes. This is normal, except perhaps the insane have a common sense of notion of what or who they are, which works more or less and enables them to function as normal human beings. So we are presently, you could say, habituated towards this assumption around a self, but it's also something where we can investigate this. Now, our culture is a little bit different from traditional Buddhist cultures, because this comes across as something that's rather unusual. This is not something that we were taught in school. It's not something that our friends are doing. But in Buddhist cultures, then, like I keep banging on about, this has been practiced for 2,500 years, and it actually constitutes a successful science. So that's just where, you know, if we engage in the study of physics, it's going to take years. We actually have to trust that what we're engaging in has validity. And then we're surrounded by a culture in which everybody says, you know, you're really pursuing the highest, you know, you're really pursuing something that's extremely worthwhile. So don't give up on the study of physics, you know, it's worthwhile. It might be difficult, but it's something that will pay off. And similarly, and that's where we had the support of a whole culture that actually, you could say, validates this particular inquiry that is the study of physics. But here then, in the Buddhist context, we also have a culture that validates that in general. But of course, then in the modern world, then we're a little bit off on a limb. You're sitting with a webinar, sort of a, you know, webinar with some ponytail guy in Northern Rivers, you know, who sort of possibly has some credentials in terms of having studied with some foreigners, but you know, it's all a little bit iffy, really. And so that's where there's justifiably you could say a justification for being very critical. But at the same time, that can sometimes also be really a strength, because if we have this, you could say, tension between this proposition and then our own hesitation, then that sometimes can actually prompt us to investigate further. Whereas sometimes in traditional contexts, you just might tag along, and just say, oh yeah, well, that's what everybody says, and that makes perfect sense. And that's where there is a danger of then a blind faith, which in some ways, okay, the product works, but also then there's not that deep sense of conviction sometimes. So for us to actually pursue this, there's very much an encouragement to be critically thinking. So anyway, like I say, you justifiably could be a bit suspicious about the present speaker, but then think about, there are some very, you could say, respectable persons like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Buddha, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and many other great masters, Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche, and so on, who really validate what we're doing here. So Khenpo says, however, when meditators address themselves to what or who this self is, they cannot find it. Then gradually, very gradually dawns on them that the reason they cannot find it is that it is not there and never was. And that's actually really an important point. We definitely have an operational condition in which we function on the basis of experiencing self and other, but at the same time, the assumption of self, as solid as we might sort of in our vague, unconscious pattern of emotional reaction, as much as we might accept it as being primary in our life, if we investigate, then we actually see that there is nothing there. And that's where we apply this thing that we call analytical meditation. And that is interestingly initially based on analysis, but then it's consolidated on us meditating and actually finding rest and discontinuing the habitual narratives that normally perpetuate this, you could say, reactionary pattern. So Khenpo says there is tremendous emotional resistance to this realization. So it takes a long time to break through. But when it does, there is an immediate release of tension and suffering. The cause of it has gone. The cause of it was a mental attachment to something that was not there. So let's say we're being insulted by a 5-year-old. We could take it very personally. The 5-year-old is calling us rude names and so on. We could get very insulted. But then at one point we also might say, what's really going on here? There's a 5-year-old who, for one reason or another, perhaps hasn't slept, is coming down from a sugar high, etc., etc. And if this person might think that we're not, what they like, then what's the deal? And that's where we see the emptiness of the situation. And that's where we see the emptiness of you could say, the words, and also we can see who's it actually touching. And so there is a place where this investigation is something that corresponds to something that we very often fall back onto, but where this haphazardly, what we're doing here, lost sound. Oh dear, is it still lost? If you can't hear me, let me know. That's a joke. Okay, sound is back. Okay, so it was just gone for what, a minute or something? Anyway, don't worry, I'm just repeating myself. Yeah, this is a good thing. In Buddhist tradition, we actually have a whole tradition of repeating ourselves a lot. You should, if you think I'm repeating myself, you should see some of the sutras. So, all right. Okay, we're talking about no self and making a strong case for it. Okay, so So then Khenpo continues saying, sometimes the resistance to the realization takes the form of irritation. One is used to being able to explain things to oneself rationally. Experience of the self is so direct and in a sense so obvious, there seems to be no reason to include it in one's rational explanation of things. On the other hand, when one does try to explain it to oneself, the whole thing is so irritatingly subjective. It seems one could never reach any satisfactory conclusion. Instead of letting the mind rest in the actual experience of that paradox, one gets frustrated and irritated at not being able to form a watertight explanation of what the self is. I'd like to make 2 points here. One is I can't get over that this Khenpo, who was probably in his 50s or 60s when he began to teach Westerners, that he actually sat down and had these conversations with his students to the extent that he actually became sensitive and aware of these kind of very emotional reactions that are quite special to the modern Western audience, or to the modern audience, put it that way. Traditionally in Asia, you would just hear the Lama say there is no self, and then you'd go back and you'd sort of just keep going at it. And if you were irritated or not or whatever, that's secondary. You wouldn't talk about it. You just, you continue. So this it really sort of is very moving actually to be sensitive to how the Khenpo has been involved. This reflects conversation with his students, and this is really wonderful. The other thing is Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal. She coined a phrase that she calls the open question, and that's the same thing actually, which is you cannot find an answer here. You won't find anything, and you just leave it at that. You're just investigating, but that continual process of just questioning the validity of yourself, that just sustaining that and actually being happy to not necessarily having some new dogma, some new like, aha, I found it. Just continually questioning where is the self, not in particularly in the meditation tradition, like in the Mahamudra tradition, we say the not finding anything is the great discovery. So that's where that irritation, we could replace it with just being content with not necessarily finding anything. So the Khenpo says it is important to notice that, not that we can't find anything, and also just being sensitive to the irritation and be aware of it. If one tries to push that irritation out of one's mind, one will never have a deep realization of the not self. So that's where I would say let's have a little bit of a sense of humor about it. There's the annoyance, and then we can just watch ourselves being annoyed. Thing is that the annoyance and the irritation comes from us being very serious. So in some way you could say it reflects a wholehearted attempt, but also the moment that we get too serious about it, that's also where there's a little bit, so it's a little bit funny. So we could just leave it at that. We're irritated, but that's okay. He says, clinging to the idea of self is like clinging to the idea that a piece of rope in the dark is a snake. This is, of course, again, irritatingly often that we get that image. But that's where this image actually is so apt, because the solution lies in simply just investigating. And it's on the basis of looking that we see that there is no snake. There is, in fact, just a piece of rope. So Khenpo says, when the light is turned on and one sees that there is no snake there, one's fear and suffering that arose from clinging to it as real dissolve. The snake never existed in the first place. So we're simply once clinging to that idea that caused the suffering and nothing else. The wisdom that realizes not self is like the light that revealed the rope that was not a snake. So again, this is not about us suddenly arriving at an aha moment. It's just being aware of that self as it sort of drives us, and yet not necessarily being that sort of, you could say, submissive to the demands of the self, and just sort of giving it a bit of space, listening to it. It's a little bit like a grumpy, a grumpy person we hang out with. We're listening to them to some extent, but not letting them control us necessarily. So clearly, in order to end one's own suffering, there's nothing more important than to realize that when one takes the body and mind to be a permanent, single, and independent self, one unthinkingly attributes to them qualities which they simply do not have. Nothing in the whole stream of mental and physical phenomena that constitutes one's experience of body and mind has the quality of permanent, unitary, and independent existence. Again, this is something that actually we can very easily investigate, and we just ask our friends, am I always the same? And our friends, partners, close loved ones, they will tell us, no, you're remarkably inconsistent, remarkably changing, unreliable, up and down, and very, in one way or another changing. Of course, we might have a remarkably sort of, you could say, consistent personality, but we have to admit that there's no basis really for this assumption, this permanent, unitary, independent existence. It is all changing and impermanent, moment by moment. One's persistent effort to treat it as if it were a self makes it a constant stream of suffering. And that's where meditation is so good, because that's where we sustain an awareness in which the thoughts that constitute very much the drama of our existence, they come up and we just look at them, but they come one after the other, one thought after another. Sometimes we get carried away by our thoughts. Sometimes we're just aware of these thoughts, but they come up and they're never just consistent. They always come up, followed by another thought, followed by another thought. And it's really on the basis of our distracted tagging along and being controlled by these thoughts that this psychology of me gains traction. If we just remain aware and open, these thoughts come and go. And that's also where we discover a remarkable quality in ourselves, which is an aerial perspective, a much greater openness, and a relaxed condition. So that's where we can discontinue this stream of suffering. So Khenpo says, realizing not self is the first step to realizing the empty nature of all phenomena. This is why the first teaching of the Buddha concerns the three marks of existence. And that's associated with our delusion, which is suffering, impermanence, and not self. Suffering is when we subscribe to this, you could say, making a big deal out of ourselves, simply just, you could say, perpetuating our self-centering doesn't help. Not, you could say, conducive to happiness. And that's where we would say fixating the short definition of this is what we say: anything that is dualistic is suffering. Songtse Rinpoche would say emotion is suffering, but that's understanding that emotion is effectively what is duality. The Tibetan is sakti, which means having fallen down, meaning having fallen into duality. And that's where this notion of emotion then constitutes really the foundation for our suffering. Impermanence, well, that's also where we're not just philosophically sort of musing and saying, oh yes, everything will eventually pass. It's that we would say anything that is composite, anything that's put together, anything that we have that, is composite on, in many different ways, our psychology and particularly stuff, we can analyze it. Anything that's composite is impermanent. And finally, we'd say nothing has a self. And that's again a bit more going, this is where we're presently looking at also. This is where it's not just saying things are impermanent, etc., but it's actually saying there is no essential self. It's all in terms of the objects out there. It's imputed. The moment that I call this cup a cup, it's really just on the basis of our shared language that we identify this, you could say, this conglomeration of, China or whatever it is, that we refer to this as a cup. There's absolutely no absolute cup around this. It functions as a cup, labeled a cup for all practical purposes. Yes, it's a cup, but there's no absolute cup in this. And that's where we would say there is nothing in this that is ultimate cup. And that's where we understand that in terms of the objects out there, and the same with ourself. We cannot find anything that is unchanging, unitary, and impermanent. So then Khenpo then is speaking about the dream example. So he says the Buddha often used the example of a dream to illustrate his teachings on emptiness, and this example can be applied with increasing subtlety at each stage of the meditation progressing on emptiness. So this is something that, just like the example of the snake and the rope, this we'll hear again and again. Where the snake and the rope tells us the value of what we call vipassana, the value of insight. The dream example, Khenpo says, is a good example for showing how the two truths, relative and absolute, work together. So things appear. This was a cup, yes, but absolute, not really. There's not any absolute unchanging. And that's where we talk about absolute truth. And that is, again, the dividing line between delusion and not delusion. The moment that we solidify things, that's where we work up the drama around what we then end up calling samsara. Khenpo says, in a dream, there is a sense of being a person with a body and mind, living in a world of things to which one feels attracted or averse, depending on how they appear. So we have dreams. In the dreams, we have situations that are agreeable and situations that are disagreeable. So we perceive a solid sense of body and mind. So Khenpo says, as long as one does not realize it is just a dream, one takes all these things as real, and one feels happy or sad on account of them. For example, one may dream of being eaten by a tiger or burnt in a fire. In the absolute truth, no one is being eaten or burnt, but still, in terms of the dream, one might really suffer as if one had been. The sufferings arises simply by virtue of the fact that one identifies oneself with the person in the dream. As soon as one becomes aware that it is only a dream, even if the dream does not stop, one is nevertheless free to think, it does not matter, it's only a dream. It's not really happening to me. So that's where sometimes in dreams, if we recognize that we are in the dream, then the sort of the solidity of the dream sort of is lightened, and we have less worry. We have a whole different relationship to our experience. So Khenpo says the person that was suffering in the dream only arose as a temporary manifestation dependent on the condition of one's not being aware that it was only a dream. It had no permanent, unitary, independent self of its own. So this is the kind of stuff that might boggle the mind a bit, but we should stay with it. We should think it through. See, how does that apply? You know, in fact, we're just lying in our bed. It's only on the basis of our imputation of something solid onto what is in fact just conjured up on the basis of our experiences. So understanding this intellectually, he says, is not enough to free oneself from the strongly ingrained habit of clinging to one's mind and body as a permanent, single, and independent self. One has to examine the stream of one's mental and physical experience again and again, reflecting on what one does and does not find until one reaches total conviction and certainty. Having become convinced of what is the case, one then has to meditate, resting the mind in this newfound knowledge until the veils caused by one's habitual patterns of thought have finally dissolved. At this point, direct, unmistakable realization of not self arises, and it is this genuine experience that actually liberates one from suffering. So that's why we then need to engage this this wisdom that sees no self. And while we establish that on the basis of this analysis, and where we analyze in order to arrive at conviction, we need to persevere until this conviction takes place. So this is not about becoming a card-carrying Buddhist, faithful to the Buddha, but it's about actually the Buddha keeps saying to us, look, 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 there's nothing there. You know, it's like a bit like if somebody's on drugs or somebody's having a nightmare, they're having some conviction that there's something that's really there, some boogeyman or whatever. And we just know that it's not there. We're not converting them to our point of view. We just want them to look until they eventually see that there's nothing there. Or, you know, when the drug wears off or they recover from their fever or whatever, then it's not about them accepting our point of view. It's just that they see that there actually was never anything there. And that's the Buddha's wish. The Buddha is not trying to sell us a new idea. So this is where we've got to give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt and persevere in this thing that he's insisting. You know, try it. Actually, I have a friend who used to tell me about what's it called? I don't know, actually. I have a friend of mine. He's sometimes in these courses who does this sonic, what's it called? Harmonies. You get the what's
the two parts of your brain where you get the
well, it just let's just see. Let's see, David Hikes, are you here? David, are you here? David does this. He's done some amazing music with this. But it's essentially that you start intoning something really powerfully, and then actually what happens is, it's strange. Your skull actually starts to vibrate, and these sort of overtones, they start to happen. And I remember I had a friend who said, you know, this is really, you should try this. And I'm like, yeah, you know. And then once I was driving up it was the Highway 1 up through Carmel in the US, in California. And it was late at night, you know, and I was getting sleepy. So I started sort of intoning these Japanese, like, whoa, whoa, yelling, sitting in the car, yelling loud to myself, right? And all of a sudden, this thing takes off. The sound begins to happen, right? So all of a sudden, I discovered this thing that my friends had been talking about, and I sort of just didn't, you know, I didn't really. No, I said, oh yeah, that's interesting, but so what, you know? And I tried it a bit, didn't really happen. But there I actually discovered it. And I was like, wow, this is for real. So that's what we, you know, sometimes these things, you know, we need to actually go there, and actually then it becomes something for real. Harmonics, yes, harmonics, yeah, that's what it's called.
So you produce the harmonic tone yourself, and then your body.
Yeah, so there's a place where
I play a little bit with the tube and throat singing.
Okay, yeah.
Overtones and
yes,
yeah.
That's right. What is it called again?
Well,
Tuvan throat singing.
Where they do the really low
yeah. But that Tuvan throat singing, I think it kind of precipitates that. Anyway, David, he was talking about how, you know, actually the Gyuto monks, they also they're on to that. Yeah. Anyway, so someone says here, irritation, frustration come not from being told that there is no self, but from not understanding, not catching how to realize it. Well, that's actually that's again where the value of simply just seeing, can we find a self? Can we? Is there a self? And we just need to, of course, when we're, you could say, very determined to find out, then we get serious. And that's where irritation happens. But we shouldn't let that throw us. So that's where we accept, in a way, this thing that Elizabeth Mattes Namgyal refers to as the open question, the sort of not finding anything. So we can work with this in terms of analysis, and we can also work with it intuitively in terms of life, where we just see that we're so much better off when we just let go of our, you could say, uptightness around self. Yes, dreams, but real life is not exactly like dreams. Well, that's where the Khenpo is actually proposing that. So this is where we actually need to go, and like I was saying, with this thing with the harmonic chanting, we should actually see, is that not the case? Let's see, when we have a dream, then it appears to us that this is solid. And also in our life, what we get worked up about are when we take things for being solid. Yes, it's true, we need to relate to things and so on, but the attribution of solidity, that's external to us, and we can see how often we're actually less effective in our life when we get worked up. So merely from the point of view of relating to phenomena as they are, we need to realize that we are actually attributing something that's actually not intrinsic to the situation, not intrinsic to ourself, that trips us up and disables or renders us less capable of relating to the reality of things. So we actually, basically what we're saying is we go off into a delusion, perpetuating a delusion of a self. Anyway, all of this discussion is very good because it's essentially prompting us to look more at the self and question it. So it's not like we're just going to go, aha, you know, right away. It's going to be sort of, it's intended to linger. But again, please make no mistake of it. This is something that men and women for 2,500 years have undertaken as a important investigation, and nobody has come to this as something where we're just like, oh yeah, the Buddha's right. It's really like, okay, this is not easy. And that's where we engage in this analysis. So all the Buddhist traditions, they operate with this notion of anatta or anatman. So it's worthwhile considering. Let's see here. Okay. Method of investigation. So Khenpo says, instinctively, we identify ourselves with our bodies and minds. We have a very strong emotional attachment to them, even though our whole idea of self and mind is very vague and confused. So that's also an important point. It's really just on an assumption. For example, when we are sick, we sometimes say, I am sick. Yet in the same breath, we may say, because I have a headache. So that is that I am sick? Or is that I have something that's external to me, the headache? What do we mean? So do we mean the I is one thing and the head another? I am sick, and then we say I have a headache. So is this I and the head, are these two different things? Because I have a headache, that's I here and headache there. But then just before we say I am sick, that's it. And hopefully it's I hope at least I would say I have always thought that it's really paying the Buddha, you could say, the courtesy of at least to think about it, you know. Don't just dismiss the Buddha as, oh, well, whatever, you know. Actually, we actually need to trust the teaching enough to actually doubt it. Doubting the teaching is a really good thing. That means at least we're not just like, whatever, you know. That's where we're actually engaging. So, or do we mean that the head is the I? That's right. I'm sick. I have a headache. Okay, well then, you know, I am sick. So that's the I is the head, etc. We need to actually really get to the bottom of this. So one should begin one's investigation with these very common sense notions of I, and I the doer, or I the experiencer. But from the point of view, actually seeing you could say, the contradiction or the paradox. So the Khenpo says, one could think, for example, of having one's limbs and organs removed and transplanted. If one were given another man's heart, would it really affect the I? Okay, I have to see if there's any Danes here. Because in Denmark, we have a wonderful little, we have a lovely story. There's a guy, an author called Peter Seberg. And Peter Seberg, he wrote a little vignette, a little short story called The Patient. And it was, yeah, has it been translated? Anyway, you might be familiar with the theme, right? So there's a guy who first has, you know, he loses his arm, but they put in sort of, you know, artificial arms, and eventually, you know, his liver is not working. They can put in an artificial liver. You know, his lungs are not working. They can replace the lungs. He has a heart transplant and gets a new heart. Finally, something got to the head. But technology was very advanced at that point, and they actually could replace the head. So at this point, you know, his wife comes in and he says, darling, do you still love me? And there he is with a completely replaced body and a completely new head. And she says, of course, darling, I do. But, you know, it sort of prompts some sort of reflection around it. And that's a very interesting thought also. And also, yes, there's somebody here who's French, might be a few. There was an artist called Robert Filliou, and another artist called Edwige Regenwetter. So even though her German name, she was French, and they actually they were part of a movement called Fluxus, and very much conceptual artists. I remember they published a book called La Siège des Idées, and I mean the seat of thoughts. And it was really, what is the chair? Is it the legs? Is it the seat? Where is the seat? You know, looking at them, they did a whole thing, you know, as these Fluxus people do and conceptual artists do. They had a whole little sort of book with all the sort of the analysis of the chair, trying to find the chair, you know, in the chair. That's pretty much what we're doing here, beginning to get to the bottom of this paradox, which in fact just spells out what we call the two truths. Yes, there's a conventional label, but actually, is there really an essential chair? Is there an essential person? So that's where Khenpo says, you know, one could think, for example, of having one's limbs and organs removed or transplanted. If one were given another, would it really affect the I? We naturally think that I, the experiencer doer, has now received a new heart. One does not think that one is grafting a new heart to the I as such. How far can one go with this process? When with limbs and organs, it seems quite clear that the I is a separate entity. But what about the brain? Suppose one had another man's brain implanted into one's skull. Would this affect the I? One might find oneself wondering whether I, the experiencer doer, could actually use another man's brain, or yet still be the same person. So I'm going to stop here, just because this is a great place to stop. This is mid-paragraph, and I'm aware that we could have some really good discussions on the basis of that. And I'm kind of tempted to draw in some of the live audience in this regard. But anyway, we'll maybe do that. But at this point, the time is up, and let's just stay with this sort of quandary, really. So yeah. I don't even dare to say, are there any questions? Actually, no questions allowed this time. Just stay with it. Okay. So, all right. We'll yeah. Okay. We'll just dedicate. Yes, yes. That's okay. Okay. If you're wondering where this is actually Vancouver. Yeah. Vancouver and Northern Lights. Mm. Mm. So it comes all the way down. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Okay, we'll take a 2-minute break. So just to say a few things about meditation, which very likely you already know how to meditate, but you know, somehow it seems that clarifying meditation can be sometimes helpful. And the way that we approach meditation, particularly in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, is very much from the point of view of acknowledging that our basic disposition is unconfused. And what meditation really is facilitating is us to connecting with this already existing absence of confusion. So it's not so much as if we're trying to go into an alternative reality, or you could say restraining ourselves or our desires or so on. There's a certain sense of determination, of course, that's intrinsic to all of Buddhism. There's a delusional condition that needs to be addressed, and that's basic to the entire culture of what we could call renunciation, determination, such as those who choose the monastic path and those who dedicate themselves to the path of enlightenment in general. So there is a very strong sense of this is an important project. So in that sense, there's very often culture of renunciation. But really what, particularly in the Mahayana and very much in the Vajrayana context, the way that we approach meditation is really from the point of view that we allow a natural wisdom to flourish in the context of sitting. So we're not that concerned about going into a particularly profound trance or a particular profound state of mind, since all states of mind are really ultimately conditioned and states of mind change. But what happens with us really is that we get entangled with our states of mind, and that is actually more what we'd want to see through. And that's where actually we, in the context of meditation, would want to disentangle ourselves from the mind altogether. We actually would identify that there's a place in the mind that's not necessarily subject to the ordinary concepts, the ordinary thoughts, narratives, storylines, ruminations, thinking, and so forth, that we generally tend to identify, and which generally is part of creating a slightly murky, confused experience of this dimension of our consciousness. So in that sense, meditation is a place where we essentially are interested in just connecting with reality. But we acknowledge that there is a problem with us and our optics in terms of relating to reality, which is the confused dualistic mind that is very much caught up in what we've just discussed, which is this strong sense of I and the strong sense of the experience of the I, the interaction between I and the phenomenal world in terms of attachment and aversion. And that's where we get caught up in the patterns of like and dislike, and that evolves into what we call states of mind, in which we're very upset about the way that the world is, that we're very concerned about getting what we want, and continually with reference back to a self. And that's seen as really just a practice of delusion, where we essentially are just out of touch. So meditation is really creating a space in which we are in touch, and where the drama, the delusional drama that really comes from our distracted being lost in our ordinary discursive thinking, prompts this continual suffering, and we could break out of that. So connection or grounding ourselves is facilitated then in the practice of meditation by us sitting and relating to our body, relating to the space in which we are, and simply just being present and not carried away by distraction, by thoughts, and so on. It is then what we call calm abiding. The wonderful news about this is we're not actually looking for some alternative reality. We're not sitting waiting for some sort of incredible experience to overtake us. Quite simply because if we were to have some incredible experience, the problem is we'd come down from that, and then we'd be sort of like suffering from no longer having that experience, and we'd really be setting ourselves up for some new addiction towards, greater more meaningful, incredible experiences. And we actually, you know, well, we see this, don't we? This happens. So anyway, the purpose with sitting and assuming the posture of meditation, which of course doesn't necessarily mean that we have to sit on the floor or necessarily think in terms of engaging some exotic discipline, but really just means to sit still however we may, but actually assuming a good posture, like Trungpa says, good head and shoulders. But that's where then we create a framework of calm. And we create it physically with the body, and we create it psychologically with sustaining what we then call mindfulness. In Buddhism, we talk about shamatha, which is calm abiding, and we create mindfulness from the point of view of this allowing for a space in which actually confusion settles. The image we typically give is if you have a glass of water full of sand, if you agitate it, then the water is murky. If you place it on a table, the sand settles, the water becomes clear. And same with our mind. We become clear when we just sit. We are not going to be without thoughts, but if we could sit and actually be present through the practice of mindfulness, the ordinary engagement and the ordinary distracted involvement with the turbulence and the agitation of our thinking settles. There's not really anything particularly mystical or anything, there's no rocket science in this. It's really very predictable, understandable, and so on. But it does actually require that we focus the mind not in a rigid way, not in with an ambitious, you could say, agenda of wishing to attain some particular state of mind, but really just being willing to be present with the mind, however it occurs. So we're not sitting for something to take place. And that's where we sometimes have a little bit of an issue with mindfulness employed by psychology, where mindfulness is supposed to make us feel better. That's actually in Buddhism, we're not terribly concerned whether you feel good or not. We're more concerned with actually being properly present and actually being aware of what's going on in the mind. So that's where the practice of mindfulness is really just settling into being properly present. But of course, we are aware that what drives suffering is this condition in which the fixation on a self and the drama around the self, the narratives around the self, when that picks up, this drives a lot of suffering. So that's where we employ the practice of mindfulness and shamatha. Really, we employ it in order to extract, or rather you could say discontinue our ordinary fascination with our thinking. And that's where if we combine the insight that we have been alluding to here in the discussion with Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, that there actually is not a self, then allowing that you could say provocative proposition to sort of sit and simmer while we practice. The practice meditation where we, as we're meditating, we continually train ourselves in not tagging along unconsciously and train ourselves in not being absorbed by our thinking, where we, in the context of sustaining mindfulness, sustaining non-distraction, we no longer allow ourselves to be unconsciously carried away by the narratives, the storylines, and the ordinary sort of thinking. And so that's where we are not stopping thoughts in any way. We're not preventing thoughts, but we're simply just being aware of thoughts, and then, like it said before in the what we were studying, dispassionately watching the mind. And dispassionately doesn't mean that we become impassive, sort of how do you say, like jellyfish. It doesn't mean we become vegetables, but it really just means that we are willing to look at the raw material of our mind, whatever it might be. And so actually it's interesting that we're discontinuing the ordinary pickiness that we have, the ordinary censorship, the ordinary fussiness, where we sort of like to tap into some narratives, and we like to avoid other narratives, which of course inevitably results in us picking up on worrying narratives and perpetuating worry, or picking up on narratives of hope and perpetuating daydreams, and so on. But that's where the mind controls us in an, you could say, inordinate degree, where what we're proposing with meditation is actually to gain some autonomy, and actually, without stopping the thoughts, or without, you could say, rising above the thoughts particularly, we're just aware of the thoughts for simply just being the occurrences in a mind. And these occurrences only gain strength through us attributing solidity to the thinking and tagging along with these, you could say, unconscious, mindless fascination and absorption in these thoughts. It's only through that that they gain strength. And what we're doing with meditation then is discontinuing this ordinary fascination. And that's where you could say the practice of meditation really comes with three aspects, which is, one is the posture. The second is the way that we focus and direct our attention, which in this case is then directing it at the breath, and particularly out breath. We focus on the out breath because that's actually what takes us out of, you could say, almost on a visceral level, takes us out of ourselves, but also it essentially enables us to begin to connect with space. So we're not retracting into some sort of sensory deprivation in which there's nothing taking place. We can't stop our, you could say, being situated within an environment. We are part of it. And so making friends with this, we engage awareness of the out breath. And that's the second aspect. I'll come back to that. But the third aspect is then, on the basis of us having posture in which we ground ourselves, having a place where we come back to in terms of mindfulness, then the thinking that happens is allowed to be there, and yet we remain without being absorbed by the thoughts. So in the context of being non-distracted, it's not just that we gain, you say, great focus particularly. That's not really the objective. The objective is rather us no longer being fascinated by, driven by, and carried away by our thinking. And that doesn't mean that we stop thoughts, but it's more just that we develop a perspective of the thoughts in which we are not absorbed, controlled, dictated by the thoughts. And that is where we can begin to talk about vipassana. That's where thoughts are then seen in terms of an aerial perspective. And that's also where the ordinary fuel for our self-centering also is cut. The ordinary narratives that blindly, you could say, whip up the drama around the self is discontinued. The ordinary mindlessness is discontinued. And that creates not just this, you could say, a focus, but a wider perspective, a sense of humor around self. And also this breaks this self-absorption in ourselves, because we are, remarkably caught up in ourselves. And that's where this dismantling our ordinary fascination with ourselves is what opens up for awareness of the other. And that's where naturally meditation opens up for compassion. It's where compassion emerges not as a hierarchical situation in which I shall take pity on you, but it's more just that you is just as much part of my life as myself. And there's a lot of other in my life, a lot of others in my life. So that's where this dismantling of the delusion of self, which we can refer to as prajna, or wisdom, also comes with this quality of maitri, or karuna, compassion and kindness, just naturally. So in this way, we engage with meditation really as a way of discontinuing an ordinary pattern of delusion. So the component of vipassana is very strong in terms of our practice of meditation. It is very much about us getting to the bottom of what drives suffering. So the previous discussion on no self is quite helpful in that regard. Now, As far as technique goes, then yes, we sit. We don't have to sit on the floor, but we can just sit so that our spine is straight, that without getting too rigid, that just that the spine is straight. Sometimes we would say like a pile of coins or like an arrow. Also, we take our shoulders a little bit back. We take the chin in. We lower the gaze. We relax the jaw. Leave a little bit of space if we need to breathe through the mouth. And then we would place our hands either on the knees, which is sometimes referred to as mind at rest, or right hand on top of the left in our lap, which we refer to as mind in equanimity. And that's then the first aspect really that has to do with the posture. The second aspect is then the way that we focus our attention, which is then on the breath. And that's where we're aware of the breath as it exits from our nostrils, and we place our attention on the breath. We're proactively placing our attention on the breath. And then we relax and we allow the in-breath to happen without any particular focus on that. And then again, awareness on the out-breath. And that is, these two components are what we do. So if somebody asks you what you're doing in meditation, don't try to say something along the lines of, oh, I'm developing, calm, I'm breaking through the delusion of samsara, or I'm having great psychological benefits, because we're not really aiming towards any of that. Well, basically, we could just be very simple-minded and just say, when I meditate, I just sit still and I come back to my breath. That's very unpretentious, very simple. You're not obviously not trying to convince anybody that you're doing something extraordinary. You might even sound a bit dumb, but that's okay. It's about time that people practicing meditation don't necessarily sort of promote it as some great sort of groundbreaking enterprise. It's incredibly ordinary, and it's very much driven by the sense of ordinariness, just the grounding of our sanity. So in that sense, what we do with meditation is we sit and we come back to our breath. Now there's a dimension then, which is the third aspect, which is then in a way, it doesn't have so much to do with what we're doing, but more to do with what we're not doing. And that is where we train, if you like, then in not fixating on whatever arises, not being carried away by distraction. And that is then where we could say this is heading in the direction of vipassana. So the practice of the body and the focus is more on along the lines of shamatha, and the second has more along the lines of vipassana. We simply train in not fixating on what arises. Sometimes we could refer to all of this as shamatha, but as long as we're actually training ourselves in not fixating on the thoughts that arise, it does actually qualify as shamatha, because it is really there that we're breaking through what normally constitutes our unconsciousness that really drives the fixating on a self and the fixating on the object. So these are the three aspects of the technique, and here we then preface this with the practice of a text called the Treasury of Blessings, which is invoking the Buddha. And we would say invoking the Buddha and having the presence of the Buddha takes us out of a realm of the ordinary, and very much having the presence of something extraordinary is not necessarily regarded as being religious, or you could say metaphysical or mystical. It's really just acknowledging that the basic sanity that we inherently possess, which we acknowledge as the basis of the path, that sanity presently is a bit veiled. And so there's a big inspiration in invoking the presence of the Buddha really as somebody who fully manifested that. And there's a bit of a living culture around that. And that is where then we supplicate the Buddha, we sort of engage with the Buddha, with the body language of respect, with the verbal language, which is very much along the lines of bhakti, very respectful and so on. And really just like we would have a lot of extraordinary language around the themes of love, which for those who have never experienced love just might seem absolutely, utterly ridiculous. then for those who have experienced love, then all the love songs, they just make perfect sense. And so likewise also with the invoking the image of the Buddha is not seen as something that is drawing on something that's cultural or particularly mystical, but it's really just drawing on that dimension which is sacred and which is innate to us. And in this way, creating a sacred dimension in our practice precipitates this experience of what we call blessing, that there's something which lies beyond the ordinary conceptual mind. So that's where the culture of the sacred, the culture of something which is higher, doesn't necessarily indicate theism, but it does indicate that there's a dimension that goes beyond our ordinary conceptual constructs. And that is very much a key theme within Buddhism. We could say the Buddha embodies Vipassana. The Buddha is not just somebody who has gone into a particular state, but rather the Buddha embodies that which is the full blossoming of the potential that we all possess. So in that sense, there is something extraordinary happening. So the liturgy as such that we chant then creates such an atmosphere. That's the intention. So we chant that for 10 minutes or so, and then we dissolve the reference point of the Buddha as external, and then we meditate, and that's where then for about 15 minutes we sit. Then we do 5 minutes of mindful walking, and then again 15 minutes of sitting, and then we conclude with an aspiration for the path to enlightenment. So that's the program. What do we do when the body starts to feel see-through or hollow? I'm not sure how grounded that is. Oh, that happens. Don't worry about it. It'll pass. Just come back to the breath. It's all sorts of things happen, sometimes, all sorts of experiences happen. So yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Like I say, it'll pass. Just come back to the breath. Okay, we'll just take a 2-minute break and then we'll begin. Thank you. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness in the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offering, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, Lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed through beginningless time, each and every one, I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future. For the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness, caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the 3 jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata muni muni mahamunaya soha. 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 O muni muni mahamunaya soha.
Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. 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 Om Muni Muni Mahamunaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to rise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection, from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas, may I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the world and the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dharmata where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self in mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be free. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignataha. Akashasya stiti yavat yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignataha. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignataha. Tavan mama stiti bhuyahat jagadukani nignataha. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. So thank you very much, everyone. I have one little announcement with regards to the next few weeks where there will be a break. So the next 2 Mondays will be a break. I'll be canceling it so you won't get reminders in your email, and that when you get the reminder again, then it will mean that it's actually happening. So in that way, well, like I said, we'll meet again. It will be the 1st of November. So nothing happening on the 18th, and also not on the 25th, and then again on the 1st of November. So I'll see you then. Thank you very much.